David Corn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
Together,
we're
bloggingheads.tv.
Did we synchronize that adequately?
For what they pay us, that's as good as they're going to get. Now, I don't know if I've spoken to you since your honeymoon.
I don't think you have.
Well, I just have to tell our viewers that you had one of the most politically ecumenical weddings I've been to in a long time. Not only were people like me and Rachel Sklar of Huffington Post and Juan Williams there, so was Cal Thomas and other conservatives. So, Jim, you, at least socially, certainly crossed many lines.
Well, I mean, and David, I know we will tax the patience of the Blogging Heads audience, but it was very kind of you to come, and your wife. And we felt better about just being here in Washington because of that. And it's a reminder that, you know, as the cliche, which is always stated and then rarely observed, you can disagree without being disagreeable. You can maintain a tone of civility. I think that's terribly valuable for our democracy, and
especially when you have a Blues Brothers band playing good music.
It was fun. It was fun to have the Blues Brothers straight from jail.
Yeah, I didn't know that you knew Dan Aykroyd, and how you got John Belushi back from the dead. I don't even want to ask.
Cal Thomas was involved.
Well, he's into resurrection. I know that. Well, let's move on to our special in-play edition of Blogging Heads TV. And the first question I have for you today is: has John McCain put in play the whole issue of the Supreme Court in the 2008 election? He gave a speech yesterday, which no doubt you watched, riveted by every word, in which he tried to make the Supreme Court a defining issue between him and Barack Obama. Do you think it is? Do you think it helps? Do you think it works with moderate independents? Is it about rallying the base? And do you think the recent court decisions make that easier or more difficult for him?
I think the Supreme Court is always, not always, oftentimes a huge issue. This whole string of 5-4 decisions on D.C. guns, on Guantanamo, on death penalty, to name three, are a reminder that, again, it's a 5-4 court. And both liberals and conservatives, who are, you know, they will each side won some and lost some in this last little go-round of decisions, are on notice that Justice Stevens, who's in his mid to late 80s, and all the rest of them, none of them are exactly young. The stakes are huge. I mean, for example, even though the conservatives won, as it were, on the Heller case, again on
the D.C. guns
in the District of Columbia, it was 4 votes out of 9 voted essentially to obliterate the Second Amendment, to simply say it's a collective right, not an individual right. So all conservatives are happy.
Or to have a literalist interpretation of that clause of the Constitution.
That's right.
Whichever way you want to say. What I found funny about John McCain is he gets out there and he says, he picked up the conservative anti-court rhetoric. These are activist judges, they don't listen to legislatures, and yet the Heller case was a case in which the legislature spoke, and now you have judges saying, you can't do that. So, there's always hypocrisy. People use this activist charge whenever it suits them, and they don't care about it when our judges are being activists in their regard. But what I think, too, is, McCain has this awful problem of walking the tightrope between his base and which is pretty far right, the Republican conservative base, and those moderate independents, some Republicans in the middle, who are drifting more and more towards the Democratic Party, more and more away from rock solid conservatism. And I don't think too many Americans wake up each morning saying, "My God, things would just be better if we had more Scalias on the court." I mean,
I'm not so sure. I think, for example, on the Guantanamo decision, when Justice Scalia wrote in his stinging dissent on the Boumediene case, I guess it is,
yes,
that this decision will lead to the deaths of Americans. And when he says that, American soldiers have to consult lawyers before they shoot back at enemies in places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, the answer, of course, is no. They do not have to consult lawyers.
And Scalia's answer is yes.
Well, he is wrong because they've been doing it for years now without consulting lawyers, and this, that's demagogic rhetoric, unfortunately, from a Supreme Court justice, which Scalia is famous for.
Right, but fair enough. This only your question originally was
do Americans want more Scalias on the court? Do they wake up each day thinking that's what this country needs to straighten itself out? I don't think they do, but John McCain obviously thinks otherwise.
I also think that there was a very sort of notable article in the New York Times 2 or 3 years ago when Roberts and Alito were up for nomination. I guess it was the spring-summer of 2005 into the fall. And the point was made that, look, that in the years past, liberals had gone to the Senate Democrats and said, listen, the country hates all these Scalia, Clarence Thomas type judges. Let's have an active campaign against them. And so they launched one, or tried to, against Roberts and Alito, and failed totally because, in fact, the country is right of center on most of these issues, not left of center. And so, in fact, these judges are kind of popular, especially when they can be tagged as activists on things like giving rights to Afghan terrorists. You get out there and you say, we will appoint judges who will criminalize the right to an abortion. You get out there and make that case, and to this population now, and we'll see how that plays. Well, okay, obviously you're right. That's the question. McCain, though, thought he could get votes on highlighting his idea about judicial selection, and I haven't yet noticed Obama giving his speech yet, which kind of tells me that McCain...
Obama has been pretty clear on that he likes the Ginsburg and Breyers, and those are his models.
I'll wait for his bit.
And he's also responded to McCain by raising the abortion rights issue. Okay. And I think the gay rights stuff doesn't play as much with those middle voters as it did 4, 6, 8 years ago. That's a generational thing that the Republicans are on the losing side of.
You might be right, but there's still the issue of war on terror, gun rights, and so on and so on. And so
the gun rights thing is now, maybe to McCain's detriment, seems to have been taken off the table with this decision.
Well, actually, that was kind of the point of this. There's been a lot of discussion in conservative circles that the first of all, this decision was 5-4. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of trepidation at the NRA years ago when the Heller case first got going, because they were afraid they were terrified of putting the Supreme Court on record for the first time in 70 years on this whole issue of whether or not there's.
In other words, there goes the fundraising letters.
Well, no, right? they were afraid they'd lose the decision. Yeah. They would go 5-4 against them.
Well, that always happens with advocacy.
Well, okay. The point is, it's any gun-owning American would say there are 4 votes in the Supreme Court now to, in effect, take away my gun. And in addition, in the dicta in the decision, where I think it was Scalia writing all 3 of these, Scalia said, now, of course, there are exceptions for special zones for safety. Right. There are exceptions for felons, and there are exceptions for unusual weapons. Now, obviously, nobody wants your neighbor to have a A-bomb or a MiG-25.
Why not a laser?
Well, that's the point. What
about a machine gun on the front lawn?
Well, okay, here's the question. And so what will, New York City and the District of Columbia and Berkeley, California, and President Obama do about weapons and guns and whatnot that the founders never even dreamed existed?
Yes, tactical nukes, particle beams, electromagnetic EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapons.
I would just say this, is that I think McCain has a strong issue here. I've heard Frank Donatelli, who's the McCain sort of agent in place at the Republican National Committee, saying, look,
even though this guy McCain campaigned in 2000 on closing the gun loophole at the loophole at gun shows,
well,
and he's flip-flopped on that,
that's
right?
That was when McCain was pandering. His entire political strategy was pandering to the media. Now his political strategy is trying to get elected. He got
so this is
the media dropped him like a hot potato because they're in love with Obama, and so if McCain has any chance to win this election, it will be because he rallies the conservatives.
I think it may be harder with this decision, but we'll see. Let's move on to another kind of conservative issue. Has Barack Obama put religion into play? Yesterday, this week, he announced his faith-based initiative. Interestingly enough, he had 2 very unusual supporters, David Quo and John DeIlio, who both were involved with Bush's faith-based initiative, and and left the White House, saying that the Bush White House was not sincere about this, and it was just done for pandering purposes. It strikes me that when Obama talks about his own faith and the connection he sees between faith and doing good works, he says, to believe in Christ, one has to do good works as well. He's far more convincing in his rhetoric and his manner than John McCain. So if we're talking about, from the Democratic side, either swiping some evangelical voters or making them hate the Democrat less than they might otherwise, making it harder for John McCain, Obama has really put McCain on the defensive.
I agree.
Okay, next topic.
I have great respect for John DiIulio, and I know David Quo pretty well. He's a great guy.
So what does it mean to you when these guys are now backing Obama on this?
It means a lot. I mean, it doesn't necessarily change my view of Obama or McCain, but it does mean something. And more, forget me, it means a lot to a lot of people. I freely grant that. There is a huge number of younger evangelicals who are, the cliche that they're worried about, global warming and poverty and so on. It's not a cliche, it's true. But I will say this, in the end, for the vast bulk of evangelicals, abortion, right to life, is a deal breaker. And I just don't think that the Democrats are going to get very far with this particular voting bloc with a pro-choice position. Now, I don't doubt for a second that Obama will give a big speech on abortion in which he tries to sort of thread the needle or split the difference on abortion in some sort of Mario Cuomo-like way, and it may well get him, a lot more votes. I think John Kerry got 21% of the evangelical balloting 4 years ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if Obama does much, much better than that.
And as you know, in a close election, the margins count. If you can, raise, your penetration of the other person's base by 3, 4, 5%, depending what states that happen in.
Right, but I would point out one thing, though, and that is, and the media, strange enough, didn't seem very interested in this. In that same speech yesterday in Ohio, Obama said, "Now, of course, I'm for expanding the faith-based program, blah blah blah, but we can't have any kind of religious test for who works in your faith-based institution." Well, okay. So in other words, if the Baptists are running something, and a Hindu applies, they have to hire him. If the Catholics are running something and an atheist
they can decide
applies,
not to participate in this program.
Okay. Well, in any case,
I've known plenty of church organizations that have people working for them that are not of that faith.
You're right, but it's now a new.
You just can't discriminate.
It's now a new rule. I mean, we're going to get back to all these.
If you want to participate in this, it's not a law that you have to hire these people. If you want to seek public funding, then there are some rules you have to play by. If you don't like those rules, then you can do it on your own. What can be more American than that?
Well, what can be okay?
If you don't like the rules, then just go. You can still free to do it on your own.
Argument as to why faith-based organizations work better at fighting poverty and substance abuse.
Some might. We've seen examples in the Bush administration of grants going to these groups that have been pretty lousy.
Well, okay, the argument. I'm saying the argument in theory is that the people who work in these organizations, soup kitchens and so on, are simply more motivated by virtue of the common bond of religion and sacred purpose than are just people, bureaucrats with unions and stuff like that. Now, I think that's a pretty good argument. Now, again, I've said Obama is going to do well, certainly compared to John Kerry, among evangelicals, in part because he gave a great speech yesterday, in part because he got John DiIulio and David Quo, and in part because they're not stupid. They saw what happened to Kerry, and they don't want to repeat that experience. I think the Obama campaign is remarkably able to, triangulate, to coin a phrase, on issues like faith-based, on issues like FISA, I don't know what it stands for, the court thing on surveillance, the federal, what is it, David, FISA?
The Federal Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, Obama has proven that he can
foreign intelligence
tell the left in a somewhat nice way to get lost, because I need to win the middle. Arianna Huffington had a column the other day. This is terrible. Obama's trying to move to the center. He shouldn't do it. She's entitled to her opinion. But obviously, David Plouffe, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
That's correct. That's the campaign manager.
And is it David Axelrod too?
Yes.
Okay, David, and and I don't know what David Corn thinks about all this, but nonetheless, the Obama campaign seems pretty determined to move to the center, leaving conservatives to point out what they see as the defects in the Obama faith-based plan, which, as I said, is most spectacularly this issue of you have to hire people who you can't impose a religious test on people who work for your own organization. That's a big deal.
Yeah, I understand that is for some of the community. I think, politically speaking, that ultimately Obama's ability to talk to these issues in a convincing manner, regardless of whether there are limitations that some of the experts within that community don't like, is going to trump anything that McCain can offer on this front.
Well, you might be right.
And so I think it was, I think he actually, I think it has the advantage, as we say in our business, of being true, and that is that Obama actually, having been a community organizer, having worked for a church, being hired by a church to organize people who are put out of work by closing factories in the Chicago area, that he has a feel for this, and he knows of what he talks. And so that there's nothing better than when it comes to talking about these issues, when you want to be leader of the country, to have some first-hand experience that you can convey to voters as you talk about these things.
I agree, and I would also say that Obama's speech the day before, I think it was, today's a Tuesday, the one or Monday in Independence, Missouri. As he talked about American history and how the patriots, the founders, all believed in God, and so on and so on. And he gave us, and then said, by the way, we then said, loving your country is not the same as loving your government. You can change your government. You love your country always. And then said, we got to get the country moving again. All I could think about as I was listening to Obama speak was, this sounds like John Kennedy running, in effect, politely against Eisenhower back in 1960.
Right, and I wrote a brief piece about that because, he celebrated dissent as a patriotic duty. He cited the whistleblower at Abu Ghraib, for instance. But he also said, and this is what I found interesting, he said, if you dissent, you still should recognize the singular nature of America and its greatness. So in essence, it was sort of a blow or a punch at the old left, the SDS style of dissenting and saying America is evil. And, Obama wants, as all great leaders do, as you would expect anyone who wants to be president, wants to have it both ways. Wants to celebrate the national mythology, which is partly true, partly not true, and also in this instance celebrate the grand tradition of dissent in America. And he came up, as he often does, he and the two Davids, with a wonderful formulation that encompasses basically all sides of the issue. But again, I think from a
it's like Clinton.
Yes, from a somewhat genuine perspective. I mean, if you do it too smart and you don't believe it, and you're doing it too, as a sort of a con man, it can fall flat. But given his own story and the way he talked about his own love of country and where it came from his grandfather who fought in the war and watching the civil rights movement and having his mom read to him the words of the Declaration of Independence to explain the foundation of the civil rights movement. I mean, that stuff, I assume is probably true, and that there is an element, of true faith within Barack Obama. What was the line about Bill Clinton? If you can fake sincerity, I'm not sure. I don't think he is faking sincerity. I think he has it, and a guy who came up from his family and had the opportunities he did and succeeded the way he has probably believes in the American dream as much as anybody else.
Well, if we discover that Bill Ayers, the SDS,
there you go again,
is really genuinely mad at Obama and thinks, my gosh, Barack, we thought we had a new up-and-coming radical here, and you turned out to be some sort of moderate, then I think that would be actually a good thing for Obama.
Well, I think what Obama's doing, actually, he spoke about this, I think he's trying to move beyond some of these 60s debates that I was too young to participate in real time, but still seem to have been a drag on our political culture ever since.
Well, or put it this way, a drag on the Democratic Party.
Well, to some degree, yes, but I think but actually, if you look at some people on the right, they still think that the liberals won the 60s, and they've been fighting a rearguard action ever since. Well, so okay. It swings both ways. Let's move on to, I think, another in-play question. Did Wesley Clark take himself out of play this week? Out of play as a talking head, out of play as a vice presidential candidate, although I think he never was in serious contention.
I think that what he said was just, whatever. I've watched it on YouTube, and I've seen various defenses of what Clark tried to say. From a political point of view, it was idiotic. And it definitely took Clark out of the vice presidency. It also took him out of being Secretary of Defense or anything more than dog catcher in an Obama administration. It was just stupid. And Clark, who I used to have a lot of respect for and still do, he was a general and fought for his country and wrote some, I thought, very thoughtful books about running the military and peacekeeping and so on in a murky world, with CNN cameras watching and stuff like that. I just think this is sort of an aberration, and if I were he, I would get back on TV one more time, apologize, say I just was wrong, I shouldn't have said it that way, and be done with it.
That's not
exactly what human nature calls on people to do, does it?
Jim, the way you just put it is a wonderful formulation that you and I and anybody who's ever said anything on TV or radio, particularly politicians, should have on an index card. I shouldn't have said it that way. It's not saying that you necessarily were wrong, but admitting that it's an acknowledgement of some sort of error, and sometimes that's enough to do the trick. I've gone through his remarks, and they were wrong politically. I think they were hyped up more than they deserved. I think his overarching point was valid, and everyone agrees that military service doesn't qualify you to be president one way or the other. I also found it odd that the other day on the McCain conference call, Orson Swindle, I just love the guy's name, Orson Swindle, he ran for Congress, almost was elected. Remember, he was Perot's campaign spokesperson.
A great man, by the way.
He was a POW with John McCain, and then was appointed to the Federal Trade Commission.
Right.
Anyway, he's now working with McCain. He was on a conference call about this very issue. And he went ahead and said, and started casting aspersion on Clark's service as Supreme Commander, another title I'd love to have someday, Supreme Commander of NATO, without really explaining why. And it's sort of, I think, McCain had sort of the high ground of victimhood in this little exchange, and Swindle started, dragging McCain into the gutter by attacking now Clark's service, and also appearing in another conference call on McCain's behalf with Bud Day, one of the swift boat veterans for so-called truth. So,
and a Congressional Medal of Honor winner.
Yeah, but who also did nothing except disparage, and as I think has been shown rather convincingly, errantly, John Kerry's service in Vietnam. So I wish in some ways there was, we could have timeouts or other stuff. There were two CNNs, one for the serious stuff, and one, and CNN Light.
Right.
For this stuff, which deserves a couple minutes of coverage. But, McCain is down in Latin America this week, and you don't hear a lot of talk on cable TV, and not yet even on this show, about what we should be doing regarding Mexico and Colombia and all these other matters. And I wrote a piece about that. We'll direct people to it in the side box here. But nevertheless, I agree with you that I think Clark is down and out for the count. And I'm not sure, what he really was in contention for. He was always a Clinton person, and I'm not sure what bond he had forged with Barack Obama prior to this. But if there had been one, it's been de-forged. Okay, one other in-play question I want to ask you. Then we have some really outside the beltway stuff to discuss, and that is: have the Taliban put Afghanistan into play regarding the 2008 election? If you look at the front page of the Washington Post today, it really shows that the Taliban have had their own strategic surge in Afghanistan. We've had, in June, more U.S. Service members killed in Afghanistan than I think going back to the beginning of the war. The Taliban seems to be stronger. Could there be something of a flip between now and November when Afghanistan becomes more of the problem than Iraq? And it becomes an issue that is addressed the way we address everything in this country through the presidential campaign.
Well, first of all, I think the reality of Afghanistan is clearly bleak. Afghanistan has a larger population than Iraq. I think it's like 28 million.
And Iraq has about 26 million.
23 or 24.
They've lost several million.
Probably falling fast. Yeah,
since we've invaded.
And more to the point, from an insurgency point of view, history shows that if the insurgents have a neighboring host country they can go to,
this being Pakistan, particularly that no man's land where where ethnicity matters more than national boundaries.
Right. Whether it was North Vietnam with China or North Korea with China or wherever it was with a neighboring country to sort of resupply and sanctuary and so on like that. The fate for the counterinsurgents, in this case the United States, is not very good. I was at some conference at the Stimson Center last week, and Robert McFarlane, who was President Reagan's national security advisor, said that there are 500,000 suicide bombers in Pakistan. Now, if there are 500,000 in Pakistan, it's fair to say that.
What did he mean by that?
I think his way he got that number was speaking to the number of hardcore madrasa students who are presumably being, politicized in a kind of a military or terroristic.
So potential suicide bombers.
Right. And he said it in a way that was supposed to attract attention. He certainly got mine. Something like 70% of the population of Pakistan is illiterate. I mean, we're dealing with a dirt poor, substantial population. That as Obama would say, if you're bitter and poor, you're more likely to, become a religious nut, and so this is what we're up against in Pakistan, and I think that
sounds like you agree with him in this case.
Well, I think there's clearly something going on there in an ominous way,
yeah.
And military historians will study with wonderment how the United States could take the situation we had in late 2001, early 2002, when we had the Bonn conference, and even the Iranians were cooperating on reconstruction of Afghanistan, and there's at least a chance. Now, of course, up against that was Afghan history, where they for X thousands of years they resisted aggressors and so on, or interlopers or foreigners, let alone Christians, but. In any case, there was at least a brief shining moment, to coin a phrase, back in 2002 or so, when one could imagine. I mean, people would say, "I'm going to Afghanistan. That's nice. Have a nice time. Sit in an outdoor cafe and kind of, help women open up beauty shops and so on and so on." And I think that now has been frittered away.
I wrote a piece for The Nation where I used to work. I think it was almost a year and a half, maybe even longer ago now, about Afghanistan policy in the Bush administration. And I discovered, much to my amazement and chagrin, there was no one person in charge. There was no one whose job it was to make sure that all the elements of the U.S. government, state, DOD, AID, were doing what was needed to win the war in Afghanistan. And at the National Security Council in the White House, there was a young woman in her mid-30s named Megan O'Sullivan, whose portfolio was to deal with Iraq and Afghanistan. There was no one at the State Department whose mission only was Afghanistan. And at the time, we had gotten rid of Zalmay Khalilzad, who had been ambassador, and sent him to Iraq. And they had put in a career ambassador who was a competent fellow, but didn't seem to have the clout of, say, a special presidential envoy.
Since we can't remember his name, that's an indicator.
Yeah, of course. Well, he was a career level ambassador who was spoken of in good terms, and I think he may still be ambassador to this day. But you and I here, can't mention his name. And to me, that was just, a stunning indictment of the Bush. Reckless negligence when it comes to important matters. There should at least be one person who wakes up every morning of every day, whose job it is to try to make things work, and who's close to the president and can make bureaucracies do what the president wants to happen, hopefully following decent policy. And that just hasn't been the case. We've shoved Afghanistan onto the back burner, and I'm not sure it's going to flame up enough to affect the election in 2008. But you say, military historians will look back on the other, major strategic blunder involving Afghanistan, which was the move to Iraq, thinking that everything was, fine with Afghanistan.
Right, or it didn't really matter. Who cared?
Yeah.
And of course, there's other issues too, like Osama bin Laden. I mean, the whole justification for us being in Afghanistan was bin Laden and Al Qaeda and so on. And if we wake up and realize that it might not be in the rest of 2008, but somewhere in the future, we're going to wake up and realize that Al Qaeda, bin Laden, whoever, have a major presence in Pakistan, which not only has 500,000 potential suicide bombers, but also has 75 A-bombs. I mean, I think that the sort of it's almost too much for sort of the political mind who wants to worry about Obama and McCain to think about what happens if Islamic radicals end up taking over in Pakistan, or if the price of oil goes to $500 a barrel because of some further war someplace. And then Saudi Arabia with 50 trillion with a T, $50 trillion in sovereign wealth simply decides, well, okay, Iran's a mess, whatever else is a mess. It's time to restore the caliphate, and we can simply buy a good chunk of the Arab world and Pakistan and bring it into our aegis. This is an argument made by a friend of mine, Mike Vallejos, at the.
And would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
In his view, that would be a bad thing. But again, nobody's ever accused the Saudi Arabians of looking out for our interests, and.
Right. Well, I don't think we've been accused much of doing much different.
Well, we probably look out more for theirs than they have for ours, which is known as getting snookered in the world of diplomacy. So the question, though, is will Afghanistan be in play between now and November? And frankly, I'm not sure. If a tree falls in a forest, nobody hears it. Nobody covers it. Is it heard? And I'm not sure that very many American reporters are actively in Afghanistan covering events. Mm-hmm. It does. The casualty figures are such that the statistics now are, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to be killed as an American in Afghanistan on a percentage basis than you are in Iraq. It's a much more dangerous place. There's much less of an infrastructure of bases. And so on.
We think about the legacy of the Bush years, which are coming to an end in a few months, and global warming in Iraq and the economy come to mind, but the challenge in Afghanistan may be up there, and if not, surpassing some of this.
I would say much higher than some of those. Global warming.
Well, of course, you don't believe in global warming, but we're not going to engage in that.
I'm not that I don't believe in it. I just don't believe in the remedies.
Okay. You believe in the disease, just we shouldn't worry about.
Well, sometimes the treatment is worse than the disease.
Okay. No doubt you've bought inland property in Louisiana, hoping it becomes beachfront one day, like in that Superman movie. But there were 2 things that you wanted to talk about that are let's say outside the Beltway.
I mean, they're only outside.
Some maybe even pretty far outside the Beltway.
They're outside the ken of.
This is why I like talking to you, Jim, because you're always thinking about something off the beaten path, and often it involves with being above the beaten path, meaning going to space.
There's one definitely is above, and the other one's just simply alongside.
So let's go above, because our regular viewers, the 3 or 4 of them that are out there, know that we often do a "Space is the Place" segment on the show.
Well, I mean, there's a piece in the Washington Times last Wednesday, I think it was, on the emerging space military race between India and China.
Right.
And it was by a very sober-minded piece. It quoted all these Indian generals and so on, saying, "Look, the Chinese are getting up in space, and they shot down that satellite in 2007. They proved they can do this kind of stuff, and we have no choice but to compete." Which makes sense to me. That's just the way great powers operate. 100 years ago, it was Germany and England with the dreadnoughts and so on. Today, it's this. And what struck me, though, was the reaction of the respective American presidential campaigns, because this obviously has vast implications for American national security and so on.
If they're not talking about Afghanistan, they're not talking about the space race between India and China.
Actually, they got a quote from Steve Robinson, an Obama campaign advisor, saying, in response to all this stuff about what India and China and Japan and France are doing, plus whoever else, probably Russia, on space and militarization of space, or potential militarization of space, the Obama advisor said, quote, "We don't need more battlegrounds. The idea of militarization of space is not something that Senator Obama is in favor of, and cooperation is better than confrontation." Well, okay, fine. And sugar and spice are better than coal and steel.
And what did McCain say?
McCain's advisor, Floyd Deschamps, at the Senate.
Sounds very French to me.
It does, but he's proved he's an American by saying the Arizona senator recognizes the need to defend U.S. space assets from hostile attack. The reality is that we have to protect these assets. Now, that strikes me as a cautious statement of
Exactly what you'd expect a sneaky French guy to say.
Military realism. And anyway, by the way, I wrote about this on the Fox Forum blog, which is a new feature of FoxNews.com.
No, that wasn't a blog. That wasn't a plug. But go ahead.
That wasn't a plug. It was just a statement. But the point is, what I was struck by was, look, Obama may well win this presidential election. He's got a bunch of tough campaign advisors, all named David, out in Chicago, who are guiding him on a pretty effective campaign. But what the fear I had is that there's just an embedded number of sort of liberal lefty utopians who think, well, because war is bad, and then therefore space war is bad, and so we'll just ignore this potentially lethal threat to American national interests and American security.
Knowing a few liberal lefty utopians, they're more upset with Obama now than making policy for him. So I think I am sure that were he to be elected, there would be hard-headed foreign policy thinkers who may not come up with the solutions you like, but they'll do more than come up with a kumbaya policy when it comes to space.
Frankly, as an American, I feel better hearing that. I'm just not persuaded.
If I can cause you to sleep better, sir, my job here is done. Now let's move on before we say bye to this other idea you had for building a gigantic public works project. Is that right?
Right, exactly. A giant public works project. There's an article in the USA Today a couple weeks ago now, I think 2 Fridays ago, that I had never thought about before, which is that the Chinese, as in People's Republic of China, are confronted with the following dilemma. The southern China is very wet. It's full of rivers that flood all the time. And it's just very and they have the same kind of problems we have with our flooding, and it's region specific. So they're building a bunch of pipelines and a massive, tens of billions of dollars public works project to pipe the water from the south to the north. And northern China, of course, is very dry and sort of Gobi Desert-ish.
Right.
And so they have this brilliant solution of piping water from south to north.
They have a great wall. Why not a great pipeline?
The Chinese,
they think big.
They also think there's a reason why China has been an identifiable country for 2,000 or 3,000 years, because they know something about statecraft. They know something about self-preservation. They know something about how to operate. And now, after having made some huge mistakes, like canceling their exploration of the oceans back in the 15th century, which let them get beat by Portugal and England and so on,
and that's give birth to gunboat diplomacy.
Now it's much better to be a gunboat diplomat than be gunboat diplomacy.
Be gunboated.
Gunboated, exactly. So now they're doing this, and so meanwhile, I thought to myself, okay, well, don't we have a similar situation here in America?
I saw the movie Chinatown just as you did.
Well, that's right. And all through American history, we have piped water from place to place because we needed to, whether it's from Northern California to Southern California, whether it's from upstate New York to New York City. It used to be just routine that you would have these giant aqueducts and so on moving water around.
Right.
And so why don't we have a similar aqueduct from the Mississippi River in Iowa, which seems to be Iowa and Missouri and Louisiana, which seem to be underwater all the time. Why don't we have some capacity to take that water from the East Coast to the Rocky Mountain West, to Utah, to Colorado, to Arizona.
Don't forget Las Vegas.
Wherever it needs it.
They need a lot of water.
It strikes me as exactly the sort of visionary project. If we still celebrate DeWitt Clinton, there's Clinton counties all over America. And most of them are, strangely enough, are not Bill Clinton. They're actually DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, who oversaw, and against enormous opposition, the construction of the Erie Canal, which is what made New York the Empire State.
There's DeWitt Clinton High School, where my father went to school.
Okay, he's a famous guy, and recognized as a great figure. And what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years is a sort of a weird combination of libertarians and environmentalists have come along to kibosh anything that looks like a visionary public works project. And that's why we don't have bullet trains. That's why we don't have maglev trains. That's why we don't have smart highways.
And for our last conversation, why we don't have flying rocket jet suits or flying cars.
Well, there's been a real failure of imagination as to what it would take to make America a better place to live in a deep structural way. And if obviously,
I don't disagree with you. That I do disagree with your rush to blame the Greens for all things of other states.
Co-blame.
Okay. But
no, look, I think.
But I tell you, I would love for either Republican, Democratic candidate here to have a minister of innovation or minister of imagination, whatever you want to call it. Maybe Jim, you'd be up for this post. Or maybe you just give away your ideas for free in your column.
I don't think.
But really, to sort of think ahead and think beyond, sort of the obvious things like let's get a man or woman or couple to Mars, and think, we had a few bright guys. It didn't take that many to get the internet going. Initially, working on Defense Department contracts. What else can we do out there?
Right.
I'm a great believer in government seed money, whether it's for energy technologies, communications technologies, things that may help us communally, that the market isn't going to, deliver until it sees a profit margin. But there are, obviously social utilitarian profits in all sorts of endeavors. And maybe perhaps in this one. And with global warming happening, we may need to come up with some public projects to deal with strange weather patterns and droughts. And if there's too much water in one portion of the country, this may be one way to redress it. I think you'd have a lot of trouble with property rights, though, getting that pipeline through.
Something really strange is happening on the camera here. And that is the Zoom is moving in on me. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Well, there, the technology.
Really and truly, this is like like the Outer Limits. We control your TV set thing. The camera is just really. Your viewers will be amused, or our viewers will be amused. But I've now become just a giant nose.
You're the 40-foot tall pundit. You were the tallest pundit already in
I was
Washington.
the tallest pundit, but now I'm the largest.
Now you're the largest.
And so I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm saying this is now. It's in some. We're going to have to talk to Blogging Heads High Command about.
Well, that may be a signal that we've overstayed our welcome.
Honest to God, folks,
and
it really is like I'm getting the techno hook here.
Okay, but in solidarity, I will move in very close to the camera as well, and I think we'll say goodbye until next time.
Thank you very much for watching. Thanks, David.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye bye.